I'm doing one thing really stupidly that I should stop doing. It's like, how long is it going to take you to figure out what that is? It's about 2 seconds, right? You've known it forever. And you could even make it less demanding. You could say, there are some stupid things that I'm doing that I know are stupid and wrong, that I could stop doing, that I would stop doing. And then you can just start with that. And you can just do that. And maybe it's just a little thing, although it's not, because it's a step forward on the proper voyage. It's not a small thing. And you think, well, what would happen? You could say, let's do this for a year or even a month. Just try not to do things you know to be stupid and wrong for a month. And that means not to say things you know to be stupid and wrong as well. Maybe that's the most important thing. Just do it as an experiment. See what happens. And it's so fun because I have people writing to me from all over the world who are saying they're doing that. They're saying, well, you know, I cleaned up my room and then I stopped saying stupid things and my God, it's like things are way better. It's like, who would have guessed it? You know? And so it's low-hanging fruit, man. Because that's the other thing. If there's a lot of things wrong with you, then it's really easy to start fixing it, you know? There's so much territory that you can inhabit. I've had people come to me who have had very chaotic and ill-spent lives, let's say, who were in that neighborhood of age, and it's true for people who are older as well, who then decided to make a real effort and to try to make where they were better, you know, instead of being bitter about where they weren't, because that's the bitterness that really does you in. It's really not good. It's the opposite of gratitude. It's the manifestation of resentment. It makes you malevolent. It's very, very bad to be bitter. It's hell to be bitter. And if you're 40 and you're not successful, then you have to accept your lot and you have to start to improve what's right in front of you. And if you do that, it doesn't take very long. It's quite interesting to watch people. Things can be a lot better in 6 months and they can be way better in 2 years. Like, it's a struggle, uphill struggle, but it's by no means impossible. And I don't know, again, what the limit of that is. I suppose it depends to some degree on the degree of your commitment. But anyway, so it's another indication of the real validity of this story. God isn't setting this up to be easy, right? Abraham's old, and his wife is old too, and more than that, she's barren. How is he going to be the father of nations? How is he going to be successful? Well, the initial departure point is insufficient, radically insufficient. And that's very inspiring, because it means that you can start from where you are.
People ask me what it's like to be on tour with you.
Yeah.
I always say, well, he takes life seriously, and it's making me take life more seriously, and I think it's making these people take life more seriously. Do you remember the moment that happened?
Yes.
Can you tell me that moment?
Yes, I can. Yeah. So it was in, I think, 1983. And this is a strange story. I came home from a party, university party, and I wasn't in the best mood. I've always had a certain proclivity towards depression, which I've recently discovered is probably an autoimmune problem. In any case, I'd gone to this party and I'd had a lot to drink, because I like to drink. And I don't know, I wasn't happy with something that happened at the party. I wasn't happy with the way I behaved. I mean, that's not uncommon, right? If you like to drink, then you're not happy with the way you behave. Those things just go together. And so, but it was deeper than that. It wasn't just that I was unhappy with the way the party had gone, but I was deeply dissatisfied with how I was oriented in life. Like, I felt that there was it was a nihilism, I suppose, that was gnawing at me. This was not long after I'd worked for a socialist party in Canada for a while when I was a kid. And this wasn't long after I stopped doing that. And so I kind of lost my moorings. And, the Christianity that my mother practiced in particular, I'd abandoned that when I was like 13. And so I didn't have any structure to orient me at all. And so I was experimenting a little bit with artistic production at this point. Not a lot, but a bit. And so I took out this canvas from my
my closet, and I sat down and I sketched out this picture, and I just let my imagination roam. And what came out was it was a crucifixion, and there was I drew a picture of Christ on the crucifixion, but with a very judgmental face, very angry face, and with a snake wrapped around his waist. And it was a really harsh picture. It was like an expressionist picture. Not that I have the talent of an expressionist, but that's what it was. And I thought, I mean, I wasn't thinking, I didn't think that I was thinking in religious terms at that point at all. And I was an absolutely sporadic churchgoer, and I was absolutely shocked by this picture. I thought, where the hell did this come from? What did that possibly mean? It took me years to figure out what it meant. I mean, really, one thing, so I'll tell you part of what it meant. So Carl Jung said something very interesting about the structure of the New Testament. He said that the gospel Christ is fundamentally, although not entirely, fundamentally a figure of compassion. But the ideal is not only compassion. The ideal is also a judge, because an ideal is a judge. Let's say you have an ideal. Well, it's a judge because you don't live up to it. And so your ideal is always looking at you like you're not what you should be. And the higher the ideal, the more judgmental the judge. Well, that's why he thought the book of Revelation, first of all, emerged as an unconscious revelation, which because Christ comes back at the end of time, so the story goes, as the ultimate judge. And virtually no one is judged acceptable. Well, why? Well, because by the highest possible, speaking psychologically, even biologically for that matter, the idea of Christ is the instantiation of the ideal as such. That's what it is. Now, it might be more than that, but that's what it is. It's whatever a human being would be if a human being was perfect. And it's an effort of our collective imagination to represent that symbolically, which we do with cathedrals, for example, when we paint the image of Christ against the dome that represents eternity itself. That's the ideal. Now you might say, well, I don't believe in the ideal. It's like, you're missing the point. So that ideal is a judge, and the farther you are away from that ideal, the harsher the judge. And so the snake was part of that, because the thing is that if you're low enough and the ideal is high enough, the ideal itself is so judgmental and so detached for you that it starts to look to you like your enemy. And so that was the painting. And it was like, and I was asking a question, that was the thing, I was asking a question. I was asking, like, what would I have to do to set this, what would I have to do to set the situation that I'm in right? And so then I drew this picture, and the picture had the answer. I mean, artistic production always has the answer. That's where the answers come from, and so that was a manifestation of imagination. It was part of me attempting in its symbolic mode of personified thinking to deliver a message. And so I swore that night that I was going to do whatever it took to set myself right, period, whatever. And I was dead serious about that. And so that was the moment. And then I don't know what I did with that picture. I hid it in my closet because I was so freaked out by it. I thought, what the hell is this? It's like some schizophrenic nightmare. It's like underneath the covers with that thing. But it wasn't long after that I wrote the first essay that eventually turned into this Maps of Meaning book. It was a poem to begin with, actually. That was how it came about first. So that's when I decided to straighten myself out.
It's very difficult to properly organize your immediate environment. And that's another thing I try to do with the books, is show that some of these so-called simple things, clean your room. It's like, I'll tell you, this is the truth. I've been trying to organize my office for 3 years. I was flooded by so much mail and so much catastrophe that I fell way behind in my ability to keep my closet organized, my clothes organized. I had 3 years worth of mail sitting in my office at the university, thousands of pieces of mail. And it took a lot of work to And it's still not done. I hope I'll have my damn room clean by the time I go out on tour, for symbolic purposes, among other reasons, to have my house in order and beautified again as well. But I like to show that simple things aren't so simple, especially if you try them. You know, I had one client, his mother had died, and it was a large family, and the family kind of fell into disorder after she died because it was all boys, it was all sons and a father, and no one had really picked up the maternal role, you know, the necessary stereotypical maternal role, and he decided he was going to try to do that. And man, you know, his brothers and his father, they weren't happy when he first went to get groceries. You know, they felt that he was kind of trying to take the place of the mother, so there was all that grief that was still there, and then who the hell did he think he was, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, people's houses aren't in order because that's really hard. It's really hard. And it causes a lot of chaos and strife to try to do it. And so usually it isn't done, and it isn't until you actually try it, like right down to the detail, that you start to understand how difficult it is, and then also how to appreciate. You also start to appreciate how necessary it is. So it's fun shedding light on that sort of thing, and the non-triviality of the ordinary. And part of the reason I concentrate on the individual is because I don't think the things we do are trivial. If you think the things you do are trivial, then you're either bringing a trivial attitude towards them, or you're doing things that you're not doing the things you should be doing, or you're not framing the situation appropriately. So, and you know, you might dispute that, and that's okay, you could, but you know, one thing that my depressive clients, for example, would say, I can't really figure out why anything is worth doing if we're all going to die in the end. It's like, you know, it's fair enough. But I said, I think it was last night in my lecture, I said, if a baby's crying in front of you and you know it's cold or hungry, you don't cease to attend to its distress because the sun is going to envelop the earth in 4 billion years. You think, that's not a good excuse. Well, why not? Why not use that time frame? And your instinctive answer is, well, that's just not the appropriate time frame. And so I would say, well, if you have the habitual inclination to apply to your own life a time frame or an evaluative framework that reduces what you're doing to meaninglessness, then you should consider whether or not you're using the wrong time frame. Right? If it all of a sudden becomes meaningless, pointless, you're suffering in the work you have to do, well, find a time frame that is appropriate, you know, sufficient unto the day, let's say. That's a good start.
I was talking to one of the leaders of the Conservatives this morning, and they're asking me about, the person was asking me about Bill C-16, but more specifically about talking to young people, because the Conservative leadership struggle is going on right now. I've been talking to a bunch of them, and I said, well, look, one of the things you could do for young people that no one's doing is to talk to them about responsibility. Because everyone talks to young people about rights. It's like, we need our rights. It's like, oh God, how many rights do you need? You know, really, like you have more privileges than any people who've ever lived anywhere. Well, it's so dull to hear that. It's so dull. It's so pathetic and what would you call it? It's so demeaning that you have to be protected and have your rights. It's like I said, there's a huge marketplace for responsibility. That's what you want to talk to young people about. It's like, get your act together and do something worthwhile with your life. For the first time in my entire adult life, the Conservatives actually have something to sell young people, right? They can sell them responsibility. It's like, well, why? Because that's where life has meaning with responsibility. The more responsibility you take on, the more meaning your life has. And the higher degree of responsibility that you agree voluntarily to try to bear, the richer your life will be. And no one's ever told that, and it's the case. You know, it's like you have 4 kids, say. Well, that's plenty of responsibility. You're going to have meaning. It's going to be rough, you know, because it's complicated. You have a complicated job, and you try to help the careers of the people around you. You try to solve tough problems and aid suffering and do all of that. It's like, it's weight, it's responsibility, but there's glory in it. There's real glory in it. There's deep meaning in it. And young people are starving for that because no one ever tells them that. It's like, you're way more than you think, man. Stand up, do something difficult. Do something difficult and heroic, right? Burst out of your bonds. It's like, that's a good message. It's a necessary message, because we have to be more than we are, because if we aren't, we're not going to survive.
Generally, if I engage in conflict, the reason I engage in it is because I think the alternative is worse. And so, if you're trying to settle things with a family member, there's often a terrible minefield that you have to wander through to reach anything approximating a lasting peace. And avoiding it doesn't make it better. And it's terrible to confront it, and it can be virtually beyond your capacity to tolerate to do it. And so people avoid it very frequently, but that doesn't make peace. It just harbors underground resentment and breeds bitterness and hatred. And so that's not, unless that's what you want, that's not a good solution.
Why do you think it is that some of the things that you've said and the way you've gone about kind of writing up your stuff has been such a phenomenon and caused so many people to sit up and pay attention?
Well, I suppose in some sense those things that we take for granted we regard as obvious, but if we take them for granted and we regard them as obvious, and then they're challenged, we often have no idea why they're valuable. So for example, I've had many clients who were considering getting married or not getting married, and they would say to me, well, it's just a piece of paper. And they thought that was a pretty good argument. And that's not a good argument at all. That's an argument that's so shallow that you hardly know where to begin. But, if someone comes up to you on the street and says, defend marriage, it's like, well, what do you know? It's like, how are you going to do that? It's what's so obvious that it's defensible that you don't have the arguments at hand. I mean, you're not a legal philosopher. And so people who do that, they think they're intelligent because they can put you on the spot. And merely the mere fact that you can't articulate a claim you share with almost everyone in some traditional sense doesn't mean either that you're stupid or that the principle itself is invalid. It just means that we tend not to discuss all those things we agree upon. It doesn't mean they're without merit. So the rules, I mean, I've been criticized, my books have been criticized, well, they're, self-help, and I think, well, I'm actually not contemptuous of that, so that criticism doesn't bother me. My clinical practice, many of my clients were brought to whatever philosophical understanding they had through so-called self-help books, and if they were reading books, that's not so bad. And what were they trying to do, improve themselves? I mean, how pathetic is that? And then to pander to an audience that needs self-improvement. It's like, well, so yes, the rules were obvious, but the reasons for them weren't. And so I think the reason the books were popular, or one of the reasons, is that I tried to make a case for why these hypothetically simple, axiomatic, propositional statements were neither simple nor obvious, and why they were also necessary. And people like to be walked through the whole process of the thought that underlies the claim, let's say. Thank you all for coming. It's much appreciated. I've been unbelievably warmly welcomed here, which is pretty good for a magical super Nazi. So,
So there's a New Testament idea that you should turn the other cheek, and that's a very tough one to contend with, because it's not easy to separate out that from the appearance of weakness, let's say, because you want to be able to stand up and defend yourself. Obviously, there's no credibility unless you're capable of doing that. You have no credibility unless you're capable of doing that. In the interview that you're referring to, I attempted to use minimal necessary force, and all I was doing was deflecting accusations that, as far as I was concerned, had nothing to do with me. And the reason that was successful was exactly because there was no obliteration. There was just stepping back, say, well, that's not accurate the way that you're formulating that. And what happened was that she had to show her hand.
And it was her showing her hand that produced the consequences that were associated with that video, which I think has been viewed, the video itself, about 11 million times, and the various clips and cuts is probably 50 million by now. But because I didn't use force or any more than was necessary, then she had to keep stepping forward with her accusations and her ideology, and she just laid it out completely so that everyone could see it. And so it's another thing you really want to think about. Like, you don't want to be thinking about this as a polarized political battle, because you're in the damn polarized political battle, and it's actually the polarized political battle that's the problem. Now, now it's not like, as I said already, it's not like you want to be a pushover, but you step away from that and you work on yourself so that you're an increasingly powerful person. But one of the ways that you do that is that you learn to use minimal necessary force. It's like you don't defend yourself any more than you have to. Like, be careful. Don't push any harder than you need to, because all you do is you generate a counterforce by pushing harder than you need to, and then you're in conflict. And you think, well, I like a little conflict. It's like, look, fair enough, a little conflict, man, no problem. It keeps your life kind of interesting, and maybe that's on the problem-solving edge. But a little conflict can become a lot of conflict very, very rapidly, and if you have any sense at all, that's not what you want. You know, especially if you have other things that are better to do, and you should have other things that are better to do. And so, you know, to deal with these sorts of things, even when you're provoked, with a light hand, there is no more effective strategy than that. And it's a real mark of sophistication and your ability to keep your temper in check. It's really something to aim at. And that's true even when you're dealing with yourself. You know, you don't punish yourself any more than necessary. When you're negotiating with someone that you love, a partner, for example, a husband or a wife, at least in principle, you defend yourself with minimum necessary force. When I've been successful in responding to attacks, it's only because I've responded to them minimally. So, for example, there's been a number of times when I've gone to universities and had pretty nasty demonstrations. There was one at McMaster University that got quite out of hand, and a worse one at Queen's University, where people were pounding on the windows while we were all sitting in the hall. But it was the same thing there. It's like control of temper, detachment, understanding that the full event has yet to play itself out, the ability to step back, and the requirement to use minimal necessary force. And when I've been able to manage that, then it's worked. And if my temper gets riled up, and I have a temper, and if it gets riled up and I start to lash out more than necessary, then that goes badly right away. And I can see that in the comments, and I can see that the memes that are made of me turn a little bit more mean instead of funny. And so this is really an important thing to know. It's like, keep your temper under control. Don't burst out into self-righteous anger, in particular against those that you might regard as your political enemies. It is not going to help you. It's not going to help the cause. It's not going to help anything. You can accomplish what you want to accomplish if you're being wise about it by being eminently reasonable. That's the thing, is you can have reason on your side, and I mean reason in the best possible sense. It's like you don't have to be temperamental and impulsive in this sort of situation. You can try to put yourself together, which I would highly recommend, and then you can lay yourself open to the attacks. Now, that means you should be able to defend yourself. You should have the articulated structures at hand. You should orient yourself properly, politically and philosophically, and even physically for that matter, so that you're a force to contend with. But once you have that down, then you play it with the lightest possible hand. And that way also you have the highest probability of let's say, of changing the minds of people who are possessed by an ideology so that they can rejoin the productive political dialogue. And that's what you want. You don't want to defeat them. First of all, good luck with that. It's like, well, you've got to live with them. You can't defeat people that you live with, because there they are the next day. And if you defeat them, well, then they're defeated. And maybe that's not for the best. And second, it's not like they're happy about the fact that they're defeated. It's not like they're not going to be waiting around to find out when they can defeat you next. It's like if you're married to someone, think, well, I won that argument. It's like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't, because there that person is, waking up next to you the next day. And so if you won,
and they're defeated and humiliated because of it, then the probability that they're going to react properly to you, if they have any sense at all, is very low. And so what you want is you want to negotiate your way to a sustainable peace. And that's what you want to do in the political realm too, because, well, in this country, there's a certain amount of polarization. I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as the media is making it out to be, as they go through their death spirals and generate clickbait like mad. Because, in the US, you guys have been voting 50% Republican and 50% Democrat for about 20 years, right down the middle. It hasn't changed that much. But these people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum from you, they're the people who live across the street. They're the people who live down the street. They're family members, for that matter. And you're going to have to live with them. It's like you don't want to defeat them. You want to bring them back into the reasonable political dialogue. And you do that by having a certain amount, first of all, by getting your act together so that you're a credible and admirable person. But then by having some forbearance and negotiating towards peace. Think about what you want as a victory. You want a victory where you're surrounded by the corpses of your defeated enemies? Or do you want a victory that constitutes peace? Well, that's what you want. And in this country, you've been able to maintain that for a very long period of time, excluding the Civil War, let's say. And there's been other periods of polarization, like in the early 1970s. You don't want this to be a victory. You want this, not in that sense. You want to decrease the polarization, to bring everyone back under the umbrella of intelligent conversation. And you want to also know that just as you perhaps are temperamentally predisposed, being more conservative, to standing for patriotism, is standing for the what would you say, let's say patriotism, we'll leave it at that, and for the utility of hierarchies, that there are people who need to speak for the dispossessed, and you have to engage in a dialogue with them for your own good as well as theirs. Because healthy hierarchies do take care of the people who are dispossessed by the hierarchies, and that's one of the things that makes them stable. It's not an easy thing to figure out how to do, right? You don't do it self-evidently by things like redistribution of income, but it's still a universal. The problem of the dispossessed is a universal problem, and it has to be addressed, and that's why you need the political dialogue. So no victory, peace is the goal, not victory. If you can communicate in those means, speaking, writing, and if you can think, you are so powerful that nothing can stop you. You think about it, well, what do you mean? Well, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're a plumber or a waitress. Not that there's anything wrong with being a plumber or a waitress, because there isn't. It's like you're going to negotiate for a raise. You're going to negotiate for a promotion. You're going to negotiate how your customers treat you. You're going to negotiate how you advertise yourself, for example, with regards to picking up customers. That's all articulated linguistic ability, the ability to express yourself. If you're good at that, you win, period. And so, right, look, there's a reason, like the children of rich people took liberal arts degrees. Why? Because the rich knew that was the best possible training for leadership positions. And it wasn't because it was a romp through the park for 4 years and then daddy's inheritance. It was because if you learned how to communicate, you were unstoppable.
What kind of relationship do you have with your father? Your real father? It's often ambivalent, right? Because there's an element of him that encouraged you, hopefully, because without the encouragement of your father, man, the world is a dismal place. It's very difficult to be a courageous person unless you have your father in body and spirit behind you. It's very demoralizing. Like, it really kills people not to have their mother. They just don't recover from that. And I think people can recover from a fragmented father relationship, but it's the next worst thing. Because if your father rejects you or doesn't form a relationship with you, it's as if the spirit of civilization has left you outside the walls as of little worth. It's very difficult for people to recover from that. So the father should be an encouraging force, but can be a tyrannical and crushing force. And so that's a very difficult thing to get right, partly because if you're my son,
then I should impose the highest standards of behavior on you. And I should always be judging what you're doing. I should be judging it with the aim of making the best in you come forward. But getting that balance exactly right is very difficult. And so it's easy for a father to swing too much into judgment, let's say. And of course mothers can play this role too. To swing too far into the domain of judgment and to be too harsh. And to the degree that the father has his own pathologies, he's going to do that imperfectly. You know, he might be someone who's the father who devours his son because he's jealous of the new possibility, the new potential, the struggle for attention and love from the mother or from the other children in the family. There's all sorts of things that can go terribly wrong. So that's the father as wise king, and that's another symbol that's been lost, I would say, to a massive degree in modern universities, because all we're taught is to tear that down and to not even notice that it manifests itself everywhere, especially in the universities, which are like they're as close to an ideal environment as human beings have ever been able to create. It's as simple as that. And if you can't be grateful for the structure of the university with all its imperfections, then you're completely blind to this element of the archetype. And that's the opposite of it. That's the son that devours, the king that devours his own son. That's a tyrant. You know, that's like the mother who's too overprotective. It's the male version of that. And the mother that's too overprotective says, I'll never let anything happen to you. It's like, well, maybe you actually want to have something happen to you. You know, it's a bit of an all-inclusive statement. It's like, no, I'm going to make you strong so any number of things can happen to you. And when you need some care, I'll be there. But otherwise, like out into the world with you, that's the right attitude. And for the father, it's like, get your bloody act together. But I'm on your side. It's not because I want to destroy you or demean you or push you down in the dominance hierarchy, but because I want the best in you to emerge. And so you need standards. It's like, what are you doing wasting your life? There's way more than that to you. Get your act together and bring it out.
My father's a tough character, and he's relatively low in agreeableness, especially politeness, and although moderate in compassion. And he's a pretty harsh taskmaster, demanding in terms of his standards. And so he was difficult to please. And that's both a blessing and a curse, you know, because the curse is that he's not pleased, but the blessing is that he thinks you can do better. And so, you know, it's really hard to say when someone's on your side, it's not obvious exactly what that means. It's like, well, are they on the side of who you are, or are they on the side of who you could be? And a lot of what is necessary paternal encouragement, I would say, you know, speaking somewhat stereotypically, is being on the side of who you could be. And I thought this through quite carefully as a clinician, because one of the clinical psychologists who had a major impact, I would say, on me intellectually and practically was Carl Rogers. And Rogers preached, let's say, this doctrine of unconditional positive regard. And he's been criticized for that, because if you actually listen to Rogers, even in his interactions with clients, it was pretty obvious that his positive regard wasn't unconditional. And the problem with unconditional positive regard is, well, you know, you're actually not okay the way you are. And who thinks they are? You know, all of us are perfectly, if we have any sense, cognizant of our imperfections. We also hope we're not all we could be, because, you know, especially if you're suffering miserably because of your ignorance and your willful blindness and your malevolence, you think, God, I hope there's more to me than this. And you really do hope that. And then to have someone who's on the side of the part of you that could yet be better, that's really something. And I told my clients all the time when they came in for therapy, when I made such things explicit, that, you know, we were in a partnership to bolster the part of them that was aiming up, that was aiming at the good. And it was useful for people to partition themselves to some degree into that part that was aiming up and that could be trusted and relied upon as an aid to further growth, and that part that was, you know, bitter and resentful and angry and sometimes homicidal and sometimes worse than homicidal, and that was clearly aiming down in every possible way. And I wanted to be on the side of the, you know, the better angels of our nature, let's say. And I would say my father was definitely that. And so that was painful in some ways, because it was difficult to please him. And he applied the same standards to himself and paid a certain cost for that. But I did know fundamentally that he had my back, and I mean really fundamentally. And I knew that that was not all that common, because many of my friends growing up, especially the group of friends I had before almost all of them dropped out of school, so that would have been junior high, they had very contentious relationships with their father that weren't predicated fundamentally on something like a mutual respect. And that was very hard on them, and I suspect also very hard on their fathers. And my father, when my friends used to come over, he cast a dim light on the bunch of juvenile delinquents that I hung around with in junior high, and perhaps for good reason. But they respected him, and they also knew that he was on my side. And so my father gave me an abiding, and then the other thing I should say about him is he spent a tremendous amount of time with me when I was very young. Say before I was 5 or 6. He taught me to read. He did that every night for months, and I remember that very vividly, and instilled in me a love of books and a fluency in reading. He believed that I could do what I set my mind to. And he really believed that. And to have someone that believed that of you, that's something, man. And, it was something that I wanted to offer to my clinical clients. Because I did believe that there was more to them than the suffering person that was sitting there, and that, with joint, diligent effort, we could sift our way through the chaff and find the wheat, and that things could be better. And one of the lovely things about practicing as a clinician was that almost inevitably happened, and sometimes really radically. And then, of course, later it started to happen on a broader scale, and I was seeing that happen in the lives of maybe thousands of people, and so.
Kids who lack fathers, first of all, they can find that to some degree in their friends. And that's often what fatherless boys do in particular. They go into gangs. And they generate the missing masculinity in the gang. Well, that's not so good, because what the hell do they know? They don't know anything, right? They're just stupid kids, and they're 15 years old, and their testosterone is pumping, and they're trying to get the hell away from their mother, which is what they're supposed to do. And they're not in the right position to exercise any authority over themselves. So that's not good. They can find it in education. They can find it in books. They can find it in movies. They can find it in sports heroes and so forth, because the image of the father is fragmented and distributed among the community. But it's very, very difficult to not have a father. Right. And one of the things that we're doing in our society, which I think it's absolutely appalling, is that we're making the case that all families are equal. It's sorry, no. Wrong. And there's no empirical data supporting that proposition, by the way. It's much better for kids to have two parents. Okay. Now, who those parents are, that's a whole different issue. But.
Okay, and if I could just add one more thing. How would you answer that question to, let's say, a daughter who was raised without a father? Because she would obviously have different ways of finding those fragments of her missing father than a boy would instead. Because obviously they're raised differently. At least they should have been.
Well, I think it's the same issue, I think that another danger that emerges, and this is Freud's, of course, famous observation, is that, if there's mom and child, or father and child, that relationship can get a little closer than it should. Okay. And then the lines get blurry and mixed. And I'm not saying that happens to everyone, obviously, but it's still a danger that's inherent in the situation. They're thrust together too tightly without sufficient resources. Okay. And so the responsibility has to be distributed more. And I really do think that it's the sign of the degeneration of a society when single parenthood becomes anything approximating the norm. It's not a good idea. And part of the reason I believe that, and I think this has to do with the overwhelming selfishness of modern life, is that marriage isn't for the people who are married. It's for the children, obviously. And like, if you can't handle that, grow the hell up. No, I mean, seriously.
Yeah, okay.
Seriously. Once you have kids, it is not about you. Period. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't about you at all. But that just seems so self-evident to me. I can't believe that anybody would even question it.
Oh, it's been questioned.
Oh, yes.
It's
Well, I'm
horrible.
certainly aware of that. Yes, it's questioned. It's almost illegal to question it now. You know, or illegal to make the set of propositions that I'm making. So that's the best I can do.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
I spent a fair bit of time talking about the flood, which is a very common mythological story, the idea that there is a flood and that the creator of everything determines that from time to time to wipe things out. And that's appropriately read as a description of the conditions of existence. You know, no matter who you are, as you walk through life, you're going to be confronted by catastrophes that have the possibility of washing you away. And you need to know how to conduct yourself in order to prevail when that happens. I mean, that can happen to you personally. You can get very ill, or it can happen to you in your family when a family member breaks down or dies or has something terrible happen to them, or there's an economic catastrophe in your family. And it can happen socially. And not only can it happen, it will happen. You know, and the injunction to Noah, for example, or the description of Noah, because he's the person that builds an ark, is that he walks with God. And that means that he has his moral house in order, and that his generations are perfect, which means that he has his family in order. And what that means is that when the crisis comes, he's prepared to deal with it and can prevail. And that's what people need to know. They need to know how to do that, because the crisis is always coming. That's why the apocalypse, the idea of the apocalypse and the end of the world, is also archetypal. It's because our worlds come to an end continually in small ways and sometimes in large ways. And so, in some sense, it's necessary to be constantly preparing for the apocalypse, because you're going to go through experiences in your life that will throw you for a loop and force you to either radically change or to fail and perhaps to die. So those experiences in life where the fundamental constants that keep you oriented shift, and then you fall into the unknown. That's the underworld of mythology. You fall into the unknown and into the underworld, and part of that underworld can be hell. Now, hell is the part of the underworld that emerges when you're embittered by your failure and you turn towards the desire to destroy. And everyone who thinks about this can appreciate that, because most people, at least if they reflect on their own experience, can understand full well the negative psychological consequences of falling flat on your face. It's not only that you fail, it's that you become bitter and turn against the world. That's a trip to hell for all intents and purposes. The fundamentalist types tend to read those things very concretely and to only project that out into an afterlife, say, or a purely spiritual world. And I'm not making any claims at the moment about metaphysics or post-life existence. I'm saying that these descriptions pertain to psychological conditions that are always around us right here and now, and that the mythological landscape is the landscape of human experience. It's not the objective world. And the landscape of human experience and the objective world aren't the same thing. There's no pain. Pain is not an objective thing. It's part of the subjective world of human experience, but its reality is undeniable from an experiential perspective. So our materialist outlook doesn't do a good job of orienting us in the world, because it doesn't tell us how to behave, and it can't. You know, it's the famous conundrum put forward by David Hume, which is you can't derive an ought from an is, which means no matter how much factual information you extract from the world, you're not going to derive from that an unerring guide to how you should act. And so you might say, well, there's an endless number of answers to the question how you should act, but that's not helpful, because all that does is disorient you. You want to push yourself out against the world in as many ways as you can, because that forces you to develop. You know, and that's partly because as you push yourself out against the world and learn new things, you become more and more informed, right, by the information that you're generating in your active encounter with the world. But also, we know that when you put yourself in new situations, new genes turn on in your nervous system, and they code for new proteins. And so you exist a lot in potential, and the way that, and you need to actualize that potential in order to become all that you need to be in order to prevail in the world. And the way that you do that is by pushing yourself out against new unknown things and forcing your own transformation in the face of those challenges. And the idea is that if you do that, let's say religiously, then you can turn yourself into a character that has enough power and strength to prevail in the tragic conditions of life without becoming embittered and cruel and malevolent. And I mean, again, to me, the longer I study this, I suppose the more self-evident it seems to me. Life is very difficult. It will challenge you to your core. To be able to withstand that challenge, or you'll warp and deteriorate. How do you develop yourself to withstand that challenge? You take on responsibilities and challenges voluntarily and strengthen yourself. How else could you possibly do it? I mean, you could hide, but there's no hiding. You can't hide from illness and death. You can't hide from loneliness or pain. It's not possible. And if you retreat, then the things that chase you just grow larger. So you have to put yourself together. And you do that by seeing what's right in front of you, regardless of whether or not you like it. And encouraging yourself to master what you see voluntarily and to extend yourself and to stretch yourself out constantly. And you do that with your eyes open. And you do that with your speech and thinking carefully monitored and regulated so that you don't corrupt yourself with unnecessary ignorance and delusion, because that will just hurt you when the crisis comes.
So this is why and then it goes back to why these meta-narratives, these archetypes exist. They instruct us on how to do just that, right? How to face chaos, how to face tragedy, because they provide examples. They set the pattern.
Yeah, they set the pattern. Yeah, and the issue is, how do you manifest the pattern in your own life? That's the crucial issue, is how do you realize the archetype in your own life? And you do that in part by accepting the struggles of your being, or perhaps even welcoming them, and subjugating yourself to them, and opening yourself up to the possibility of radical transformation in the face of your errors and faults. That's humility, I suppose. You're not all that you could be. Well, you might say, well, why does that matter? Well, it's easy to answer that. If you're not all that you can be, you will suffer more than you have to, and so will the people around you. And you might say, well, I don't care about that. It's like, well, that's unlikely, because virtually everyone cares about their own pain. But even if you have got to the point where you don't care about that, that's certainly nothing to be happy about or proud of. It's a catastrophe.
You have to become who you are, right? According to Pindar, quoted by Nietzsche.
Well, that's associated with Jung's idea of the self, is that, and one of the ways to understand that, because it seems like a very strange pronouncement, is that you are what you are, but you're also what you could be, which is a strange thing, right? And that's no more than to say that you are characterized by an indefinite amount of potential. So you are what you are, and you are the potential that you are. And that's a very paradoxical statement, because it's not obvious how you can be something that's potential, because potential isn't being, it's the possibility of becoming. But be that as it may, we're stuck with it. It's a paradox, but we're stuck with it. The goal of authenticity from an existential perspective is to pursue that which you could be. so that you can flesh yourself out, so you can burn off what about you is dead and outdated, and so that you can allow what could be to come to life. And the deep archetypal idea is that to the degree that you do that, you redeem yourself and you redeem the world around you. And I believe that that's, again, I don't think that that's metaphysics. It seems to be the most practical of truths. You can be afraid, but you can't stop.
Yeah.
That's the thing, because the fear is justifiable, but it's not, that doesn't make it a sufficient reason to retreat and stop. There's no retreat in life. That's the thing. There might be periods where you can pull back and rest, but because we're surrounded by the unknown and the unexpected, and because we're characterized by the consequences of our ultimate ignorance, and because we're finite, there's no stepping back.